Chapter 7. Almost 4 decades ago, Arthur and Letha had arrived in Forge after the iron mining had already gone bust. Even though the town was deserted, they saw no reason to change the name. A family named Twitchell owned a great deal of land in and around Forge and offered Arthur a sizable sum to take down the timber on the property. Arthur had accepted the deal, provided he could rebuild the small town as he saw fit, and he made a simple, strong request to be left alone. And of course, no questions. "I already owe you my life," Twitchell had responded. Then, forever the businessman, added, "as long as you deliver." And deliver Arthur did. Even with Twitchell's basic knowledge of Arthur's gifts, he was still surprised at how fast Arthur and his crew could work. It wasn't hard for Twitchell to be generous, since Arthur's crew would cut 3 to 4 times as much as any other, and often over rougher terrain and through worse weather. Funny enough, it made Arthur's crew both the best paid and the most profitable there ever was. The hard work and good profits made it easy to keep the deal going, and as such, Twitchell kept up his side and never asked any questions. Those same profits let Arthur's crew live and even establish small personal farms on the very land they were cutting. Arthur found it refreshing to be able to finally settle into the land and stop his nomadic life for the first time. As it turned out, Arthur wasn't the only one looking for a more permanent place to hang his hat. When good men find honorable work, it's hard to hold them back. Before long, John, Kofi, Rowan, Amasa, King, their witches, and even more of their kind had come to live and work alongside Letha and him. As with any working crew, each new addition caused a few bumps that needed smoothing over, but once all found a rhythm together, they grew stronger. Together, they couldn't be stopped. Arthur's crew of lumberjacks, or jacks as it were, developed a reputation, one that they earned repeatedly each and every year. They proved tight-knit and supremely skilled, floating more wood down Adirondack streams in the spring than 2 or 3 other normal crews could manage. Others that had passed muster with Arthur, Letha, and the rest began to populate Forge, and as such earned the title townsfolk. These townsfolk each had deep personal ties to one of Arthur's crew. All of them credited one of Arthur's men, or women, for stepping in during a time of need and giving them a second chance at life. They'd each decided the best way to honor that second chance was to come to Forge themselves. The townsfolk also knew not to ask too many questions. Truth be told, not knowing some things was easier than knowing and saying you didn't. Every so often, some logger from away would come into town thinking he could bully or cajole his way into Arthur's crew. Even with the townsfolk telling the newcomer to leave it alone, it never worked, and soon enough, such a man would find himself waking up far downriver, cold and wet, with anyone within 100 miles echoing, "I told you so." Some outsiders saw Arthur's crew as elite or egotistical. Others saw it as simply particular. It did take a certain type of man to spend days and nights on end in the wilds and cold of the northern forests. All the towns around, even as far away as Utica, generally agreed Arthur's crew was generous and kind, as lumberjacks go. On the occasions they did come into bigger towns, they seemed nice enough. As most other lumbermen, Arthur's crew would have a mighty fine time dancing in the dance halls, even if they did tear up the floors with their spiked boots. Surprising to most, Arthur's crew never partook in any of the extra services the dance halls provided, no matter how graciously and low-priced they were, puzzling the women that worked there as much as the regulars that frequented them. When they made it far enough out of Forge to their traditional stop into Paddy Ryan's pub, they would eat as much as Paddy himself could cook, but they would never touch rum, beer, or any alcohol. The kegs lining the walls never seemed to hold their interest at all. All this did, of course, was add to the crew's strange reputation and mystique, making them even more renowned. Local legends said crossing Arthur and his men was a mistake. At best, such mistakes would end in a mild humiliation, either in a river or a snowbank. At worst, a man would find himself a limb short. This reputation had allowed Arthur and his crew to make sure their legend stayed as local as possible. Any extra attention was unwanted by Arthur, and he felt he had done well to keep his own little part of the land honorable and peaceful. It had always been Arthur's hope this relative peace and prosperity would continue, even without him. While it wasn't entirely up to Arthur to choose a successor, crews needed a boss, and someone had to eventually take the reins. Arthur was confident there were many who could do the job. They'd all been together for so long that only time would tell who could and should rise to the occasion. Arthur had learned from the history of others that while blood passed down many things, rarely did it decide a leader. A leader was inspired and decided by those who were willing to follow. With any luck, such a person would still have a bit of Arthur's influence to guide them. The first sign of Arthur's decline had been his limp. Maybe a dozen years ago, on an otherwise normal winter day of cutting and loading timbers, Arthur caught his foot as he tried to stop a pile of logs from rolling onto the horses. While he kept the horses safe, his ankle never quite fully healed, even with Letha's help. Over time, it progressed into a persistent limp, becoming more and more noticeable to others, and more bothersome to Arthur. Without the balance of a good stance, he soon found his axe didn't make the chips of timber fly as far as they used to, nor did his swings make the pleasant and familiar pop when metal sunk into wood. Rowan would occasionally offer him a slender and gnarled length of oak for a walking stick, not a cane, mind you, but Arthur repeatedly refused. In addition to the limp, he noticed himself starting to squint to see into the distance, and having to lean in to hear people talk. He had always led his crew by example, and didn't like to think his own link in the chain was weakening. When he finally did reluctantly accept the walking stick, he took a bit of friendly ribbing from the boys. They thought they were clever to call it a witch's staff, but Arthur got the last laugh by using it as an instrument of correction. A witch's staff had great power, after all. Even with the growing hints of his last chapter of life, he did his best to keep the mood light. He preferred to focus on the days he had left, instead of the days he would soon be missing. No one lived forever, not even Arthur, and his soul had made many, many trips around the sun. Knowing there weren't many more, he felt blessed to witness each new dusk and dawn. He was happy he would be able to leave on his own terms. Many others hadn't been so lucky. It was Letha who planted the idea of a gathering in Arthur's head during one of her more playful jabs. "Too bad you'll miss the funeral," she said. "It'll be a hell of a time." After a good laugh, Arthur actually gave it some thought. "It is," he considered, "a shame to miss a party given in your honor, with all those that have been a part of your life." "It's more of a reunion, isn't it?" he corrected with eyebrows raised. "That's all a funeral is, after all. A reunion minus one." "A reunion? Now?" Letha couldn't help but laugh. Arthur's strange, humorous perspective was the gift she would miss the most. Even now, she wasn't sure if Arthur was playfully waxing philosophical or actually wanting to plan a gathering. "Call it a funeral plus one," Arthur suggested with a smirk, and the gathering was on. The news went out far and wide that Arthur was having a last call of sorts, and any that wished to share a story or two while he was still around to deny it were invited to attend. That spring, people began to trickle into Forge in the days leading up to the reunion, eventually referring to it as Arthur's last call and festival, spinning a bit of humor and rhyme into the grief of a goodbye on the horizon. Soon the town swelled from its normal few dozen to hundreds. On the official day that spring, the feeling was indeed fiercely festive. Food was aplenty, and games from log rolling to axe throwing to Viking chess spontaneously took place. Music filled the air, while dance pounded the earth and filled their souls. Of course, Letha and the other women had made sure the weather was appropriate, with just a quick shower in the afternoon so the little ones could run in the rain. The clouds had long ago moved away when the sun set, revealing a clear sky with no moon to outshine the stars. The children and adults challenged each other to name the most constellations in the sky. As intended, the affair had been more sweet than bitter. At the end of the night, when Arthur's legs would dance no more, he felt he had done good by his crew and then some, freely giving some of his last time on earth to those he had held most dear. People would trickle away over the next few days, and Arthur made sure to say each goodbye with a smile. He was grateful for his long life, and it was important he share that warmth before his body went cold. Arthur held on for 4 more winters before Letha performed the final spells on a cold and moonless night and sent the raven to trail his own spirit south. Years later, when Arthur passed, Rowan, Kofi, Amasa, and King moved his body to a small hill at the outskirts of town in which there was an earthen underground vault with a door on one end. Arthur would rest here until it was time for the final ceremony. Next to the vault, a once majestic pine reached into the sky, its trunk at least 6 feet through. Like Arthur, the tree was worn from its many years. Its top was scraggly and bare of needles, and only a few low branches still showed lingering signs of life. Outside the vault, each of the Jacks took a turn on watch. Not that Arthur was going anywhere, but it was important that someone was present to make conversation and receive the small gifts many were bringing to honor his long life. Naturally, in addition to word of his passing spreading around town, there were also whispers. Who's next, then? What now? Have they picked someone yet? What about Letha? Some questions would be answered sooner than others. Amasa had also brought up a long saw from the logging camp, as Letha suggested. Amasa had also brought up a long saw from the logging camp, as Letha had suggested. Though the Jacks all preferred their axes, there was no doubt the long saw made a straight, clean cut. Amasa stepped up to the thick, majestic pine and placed a hand on its trunk. "Looks like it's time, old friend," he said. He laid the saw sideways at the base of the tree and gave the first few pulls, setting the teeth into a horizontal groove. He stopped and left the saw in the tree, leaving the job for others to continue. In the coming days and nights, as each Jack stood watch, they would reverently give a few pulls and cut a little further into the tree. There was no rush to take it down, but they all knew, just as Letha did, that it had to be done. Forge had been home to Arthur for quite some time, and he had suspected it would be the place where he finally let go of this world. He just hoped that whoever would be reborn in his spirit would be able to carry on the peace he had fought so hard to find.